Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We're a certified social enterprise, and the reason we exist is because we believe that the financial industry would benefit tremendously from being more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy. And as well as the industry benefiting in that way, of course, consumers, not just in the UK, but right around the world, would also benefit. Today's event is a Transparency Task Force Book Club event. We're going to be talking about the book by Professor Andrew Clare, who's of course with us today, the book entitled The Old Lady. It's an intriguing story about all kinds of shenanigans going on in the Bank of England. We'll introduce the book when Andrew speaks in just a moment. But first of all, Nigel, can I invite you to very, very briefly introduce yourself, then we'll go to Richard, then to Alexandra, then to Andrew. Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I'm a long-time victim of bank misbehaviour, namely HSBC, since 2008 and still continuing, and have been a member of TTF for a couple of years probably now. And I also was a recipient of very kind hospitality when I visited the Bayes Business School for a super day, actually, and very well looked after afterwards with a tremendous buffet, etc. So thank you for that and your hospitality on that occasion.
Good stuff, Nigel. Thank you very much indeed. And to Richard Emery, and then we'll go to Duncan, then to Alexander, then to Professor Andrew Clare. Richard, thank you.
Hi there. So I'm Richard Emery. I have specialised for the last 4 or 5 years on investigating authorised push payment fraud on behalf of individuals, but also challenging the regulators, the Ombudsman Service, UK Finance. Now really focused on looking at future regulation and the way in which the banks are behaving or misbehaving. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much, Richard. To Mr. Duncan Hughes. Duncan, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi Andy. Sorry, it took me a couple of minutes to get my camera sorted out there. A couple of IT challenges, but we got there. I'm one of the Woodford, involved in the Woodford scandal, that's my background or my exposure to this. I guess in recent years, since I've got it, caught up in that Woodford thing, I've gained a growing interest in some of the issues that have come to light around the financial industry, and that's why I'm here tonight, just to understand a little bit more about the book and the content behind it.
Thank you. Alexandra, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Alexandra. I'm head of events and fundraising at TTF. I've been with TTF just over 4 years now. Don't really have any background in finance, but I'm learning loads every day.
It certainly is. Thank you. In a moment, we'll ask Andrew to introduce himself, but I just want to read out the notes about the book, the synopsis, if you like. Sterling is under attack from dark Europhile forces. The UK economy is in peril, and the reputation of the old lady of Threadneedle Street is at stake. Sebastian Oates, a senior economist at the Bank of England and the governor's favourite speechwriter, finds himself embroiled in a high-level political conspiracy. As he tries to defeat Sterling's enemies, his normally peaceful life spirals out of control. Can he find out who's behind his friend's mysterious death? Can the plucky economist foil the Euro-loving conspirators? Can he save the old lady's honour? Can he save his own? Will Villa continue to disappoint? And will Julia ever forgive him? We're gripped already, Andrew. Professor Andrew Clare, please introduce yourself and tell us about your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's rather odd to hear someone read out your little book blurb like that. But yes, that's a good way to start, I guess. So my name's Andrew Clare. I'm a professor of finance here at Bayes Business School now. And I wrote this book, I started writing this book a long time ago, which is why it's set in around about 2002, 2003. There's no particular date within the book. but it's around about that time. And the reason why I wrote it, there's a couple of reasons really. I guess the first one was just see if I could, because as a university lecturer, and also I had worked at the Bank of England, I'd worked in other universities, I'd worked in the city, and I was used to writing lots of different articles in lots of different styles, but I'd never written fiction before. So I just, one day I thought to myself, well, I wonder if I could. And I started writing and I wrote the first 3 chapters. And then I forgot all about it for about 19 to 18 years or so. My partner was clearing out some stuff and she said, oh, what's all this? And I looked at it, oh, okay. But then COVID hit and we all needed to find ourselves something to do. And I got back to it. And actually, the first 3 chapters that I wrote, only about half of the first chapter made it into the final book. And I think if I were to write a non-fiction book now, it would probably be how not to write a novel, because I started in very much the wrong way, with no plan, no idea what the book really was going to be about, apart from the fact that it was going to be about this character who worked at the Bank of England. And so that's why I wrote it, and that's why it finally got finished eventually, simply because my partner dug out a file which I'd forgotten about a long time ago. But there was original motivation, if you like, about why I should write about a story about Bank of England economists, which I have to admit is not an obvious bestseller. But one thing I wanted to do in the book, and I hope I did, was to sort of shed light on this weird and wonderful Bank of England world, because it is a very unusual place to be. It's a very unusual place to work. And the customs and the behaviours within that have become embedded over many, many years. I mean, I don't necessarily mean bad behaviours or bad customs, but it's just that it has a very special way of working. And I wanted to shed some light on that. I also wanted to bring to life, life in and around the city around that time. There's a couple of scenes in pubs, which is a big part of city life, and just the historic part of the city as well, which I wanted to explain to people who perhaps is very, very familiar to me, but it may not be familiar to others. So I wanted to set that scene, and I wanted to tell the world about the bank as this weird and wonderful place. I think the final reason that I thought it might be a good idea to start writing a book where the central character works at the Bank of England was in a way to pay tribute to the people who do work there. And I make this point a couple of times through the story, that they are very public spirited. Most of them work there, excuse me, because they want to do some good in the world. And most of them could leave the bank more or less at any time and treble or quadruple their salary if they went to the city. And some do that, of course, but many stay there for quite a long period of time because they believe the bank is doing good work. And so that's another reason why I wanted to write the book. So to make it clear to people that the people who work in the bank, really want to improve the UK economy for the good of UK people. So I already hinted that it was set in 2002, 2003. And at the time, so when I started writing, there was still this big debate about whether the UK should join the euro. So that's the big story that's going on behind the scenes the whole time. Now, it's a story that's probably been forgotten a little, because of course we didn't join the euro. We went our own way and we kept sterling. And Sebastian Oates, my character, is really fighting against some dark deep state forces which are trying to force the UK to adopt the euro, which he believes very fundamentally we shouldn't do. But there are implications of that decision which are echoing even today. So, for example, during the global financial crisis, the fact that we had our own currency meant that we could actually set our own policy and try and set policy in such a way which was as, reduce the costs of the GFC to the UK and the UK economy. If you think about Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain and Italy, no, they didn't have a currency of their own, and they suffered really, really greatly as a result of that. So I think probably we did benefit by not joining the euro a little. I'm not saying we had a great time, the global financial crisis, but we did have some leeway, which others didn't. It's also impossible now to think that Brexit would have happened had we joined the euro. I mean, I think it's quite difficult to, it was a quite difficult thing to untangle as it was, even in 2016 with that vote. But had we adopted the euro, I think it would have been much more difficult as well. When my character, it sounded like from the blurb that he's anti-European, and he's really not anti-European at all. He's actually very much in favour of, openness and trade and so on. But what he does see is that it could be an economic disaster for the UK to adopt the euro. And in fact, and this is my view, it would have been quite even more difficult for the Eurozone nations that eventually did get together had sterling joined. Because I don't think there was really room for another large volatile currency within that basket. And I think it would have been very destabilizing for the whole project. So he's not anti-European, but he was anti-Eurozone. So the book itself is a sort of light-hearted thriller. That's how I'd like to describe it, unveiling the life in the city. And it's I guess, ultimately, it's about loyalty. And his loyalty is tested throughout the book. So Sebastian Oates is my main character. And I don't know if any of you, presumably you've all named children or pets or something. It's actually quite difficult to think of a name for any one of those at any time. And I really only chose Sebastian at the beginning because I couldn't be bothered to think about another name. And it was a name that popped into my head, and because nobody else at the Bank of England that I knew was called Sebastian, I thought I would go with that, and that's how his name came about. But after a while, you keep calling your character Sebastian, that's what he becomes. But I guess it's quite an unlikely name for a character who's born and brought up in a semi-detached house in Dudley. But, maybe his mother was a very big fan of Brideshead Revisited, something like that. But he's our main character. He's very clever, but he's a little bit lazy. And he discovers that, his friend has died in mysterious circumstances. And then, as Andy said in the blurb, he gets mixed up in this high-level conspiracy. You're never quite sure within the book who these people are, but they have one single aim, which is to make sure that everything goes their way in the debate for joining the euro. And in trying to defeat these dark forces, ultimately he's forced to choose between his country and his loyalty to the Bank of England, and I guess you'd say his loyalty and his love for his partner and his family. And I won't, no spoiler alert, I won't tell you what he does. But there is an ultimate hero to this story, and I hope those who read it will find that he's quite a surprising hero. And it turns out not to be Sebastian. I mean, he does his part, but he doesn't do the whole thing. So the book itself is really about trying to bring to life of the Bank of England. It's about bringing to life the life in the city around those times, and a debate which kind of ultimately had a lot of importance for the UK and UK economy, and consequences that we're feeling for good or bad today. So that's the story of the book and the story within the book. I guess the other thing I would say is that there's no big words in it, so I don't know many big words. So it's quite an easy read, I hope. And people have found it to be fairly humorous and someone said pacey, which I wasn't quite sure what they meant by that, but I hope they meant that it's a page turner or something like that. I have done a couple of other book club events, and one of the things you learn from book club events, well, one of the things I've learned are things that I've done in the story which are entirely inadvertent. So someone said to me, you don't describe Sebastian anywhere in the book. Oh, don't I? So there's no description, no real physical description of him at all. So you can project your own views on what this Sebastianos character could look like. And someone said to me, "Oh, that's very clever, because you can project your own views on how he looks." And I thought, "Oh yeah, okay," but I didn't really realise. The other thing that I was told, which I didn't realise either, is, "Oh, your book is very plot driven." And again, I didn't know what that meant really, so I had to go back and look it up. But yeah, it is plot driven. I do now understand what they mean by that, and there is a plot that drives everything all the way through. So yeah, that's the story, and the very good people of the Bank of England are still today fighting dark forces, not dark forces which are trying to force them to join the euro, but the dark forces of the global economy, which are buffeting the poor UK. And I think they're going to have a very difficult time of it over the next couple of years or so. And actually, I have some slides on that topic a bit later. But are there any issues or questions that you'd like to bring up about this, or ask me, or generally about monetary policy or anything like that?
Andrew, thank you so much. The way you've described the book has made me, I'm sure others as well, very highly motivated to get it and to read it. Thank you very much indeed for that.
I hope so.
Did you enjoy writing it? I'm getting the impression from you, you kind of enjoy the freedom to do something non-technical, non-scientific, non-academic, just to express yourself by way of writing this book. Was it fun to do?
Yes, because if I write, I write academic papers all the time, and there's a certain way of writing and certain things I have to do. Whereas with fiction, you just make it up in your head. I'm not allowed to make up my academic papers in my head. I have to produce some evidence, get some data, plot some charts. Whereas this is, I can just sit down and think about, what my character might think. But what I also realised was, I quite often in my head have conversations, or have, not me having conversations, but imagine conversations between people, different sorts of people. And I didn't realize that's what I was doing. And this gave me a way to take those conversations and just sort of put them onto a page. So yes, it's like everything. It's enjoyable, but it is hard work. I'm not going to say it's like spending 12 hours a day down a mine or anything like that, but it can be a bit frustrating at times. But on the other hand, yes, I did enjoy it. And I'm a third of the way through the next one, which is set in the global financial crisis. So same character, Sebastianos, now he's moved on a bit, and now he's going to get mixed up in the global financial crisis in ways which he couldn't possibly imagine.
That's fascinating. That suggests to me, Andrew, you've had some very good feedback on the first book to motivate you to want to write another one. That's really, really encouraging indeed. This is perhaps an obvious question. To what extent is Sebastian you? And when you're writing it, are you kind of imagining yourself being Sebastian? Is there kind of this weird thing going on where you're almost fantasizing that you're being that character, if you get my drift?
I wrote his situation, so he was definitely not me. He was a single man. He was unmarried, no children, living in an apartment in northwest London. Although I did live in northwest London, that was definitely not me. Is he me? Probably not. But there are probably certain attitudes or opinions that come out which will probably be, you could say easily, yes, that's, I could hear Andrew talking. But to be honest, he's a mixture of a whole load of people I knew very well at the bank. So, there's probably about half a dozen people in him. Though, yeah, I think if I thought about it too long, I'd probably realise that quite a lot, 50% of it was me. But I'm not quite as heroic as he is, so that's definitely not me.
We'll have to read the book to find out what he does that is so heroic. Let's invite Martin to introduce himself and then Maurice. Martin, you missed the round of intros earlier. Would you like to just take yourself off mute and briefly introduce yourself? And then we'll go to Maurice and ask him to do the same. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, good stuff. Just to ask, how many people are on the call?
Well, we have about 6 or 7 or so.
Oh, that's lovely. In that case, that's a different kind of game. Right. I'm Martin White. If you like, current role preoccupation, main one is as a campaigner in the interests of the citizen in the face of the world of finance. I helped found the UK Shareholders Association. I currently work for, and I don't speak for them, believe it or not, Berkshire Hathaway, which is a wonderful place to work in a financial sense. And I take a huge interest. I did an engineering degree first before I became an actuary. And I take a huge interest in things like productivity, the understanding the economic world without having to believe any of what I call the economic crap, like CAPM and the financial stuff. So, and I'm quite a keen follower of Steve Keen, who has some very clear views about things like debt and what matters, international trade, etc., etc. That's me.
Martin, thank you.
I something I'm rather proud of. I won an essay competition about the public interest held by the actuarial profession, for which John Kay was the chief judge.
Martin, thank you very much. Feel free, Martin, to pop into the chat a link to the paper that you wrote. I know you're very proud of it, and quite rightly so. And folks, say for anybody else, so we'll share after the event the contents of the chat. If you want to put anything into it, don't hesitate to do so, whether that's contact details or anything else. Martin, thank you. And let's now go to Maurice. Maurice, could you please briefly introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, Andy. Maurice McElraith. I can't actually see myself on my screen for some reason, so I hope it's coming through anyway. I'm fighting against AIB through Johnny Crawford. They've taken 2 cases, one in the circuit court, and then they took one out again for the same thing in the High Court. And I've had 2 write-offs or 2 strikeouts on the circuit court and the High Court previously when it was with AIB. So the case is upcoming again on the High Court on the 1st of July, and the circuit court the 4th of July. So I'm basically going to apply for an adjournment based on health reasons.
Maurice, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to make use of what Maurice has just spoken about, Andrew, by talking about the interaction that most of the people have in my community with the banking sector. Less so than the Bank of England specifically. But I was genuinely very pleased when he spoke earlier, explaining that, you know, by and large, the people who work at the Bank of England are good people trying to do a decent job, helping the country's economic interests, etc., etc. And that genuinely doesn't surprise me at all. It doesn't surprise me at all. I can imagine there being many people who are profoundly proud to be working at the Bank of England. As you may or may not know, there's a huge number of people within our community that have really been hurt by banks through all kinds of banking scandals of one kind or another. Things like interest rate hedging, product mis-selling, and things like all sorts, a long list of malpractice, malfeasance, etc., etc. There's a real chance that the next Chancellor of the Exchequer is going to be somebody in Rachel Reeves, who used to work at the Bank of England. I've got no idea if he was ever there when you were there or vice versa.
I recruited her.
Say that again?
I recruited her.
Did you really?
Yes, I was the manager. Well, part of my job was as just recruitment manager for MA. She was one of the people I got in at the time.
Okay, isn't that remarkable? Isn't that remarkable? I genuinely had no connection there at all. Now, she was speaking the other day on the TV, and somebody else was referring to her as being, actually, I can remember exactly what it was now. It was somebody talking about her as basically being a safe pair of hands, you know, quite steady, quite sensible, quite data-driven, quite evidence-based. Are most people in the Bank of England that way inclined? Are they quite you would expect there would be quite sensible, rational people who don't let ego get in the way of their decision making. Any thoughts about that kind of thing, Andrew?
Yeah, there are certainly egos in the Bank of England, for sure. But I do think, the people that you're talking about, people I'm working with, are usually trained economists. That doesn't necessarily mean they know, the right thing to do all the time, but they do tend to be quite analytical, and not prone to sort of ideology, extremes. And I think you can see in Rachel Reeves that, she does appear to be quite, feet on the ground, sensible. And I think, well, fortunately, or however you look at it, I don't think any chancellor who takes over after this election really has the wriggle room to do anything other than something that's very sensible. I think what we saw in Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng was just how little room that anyone has for being, let's call it imaginative and not call it stupid. But yes, there's very little wriggle room for anyone who takes over. And I don't see a huge amount changing fiscally, whether it's Rishi getting back in and presumably, no, he's stepping down, the current chancellor, isn't he, Hunt? But anyway, whoever he appoints as the chancellor then, or Rachel Reeves getting in.
Yeah.
So I would say a reasonably sensible approach. It's not extremist at all.
And you mentioned Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. It would be remiss of me not to pick up on that as an opportunity to ask you a question about it. So the well-informed economists of the Bank of England, no doubt you still have friends there and so on and so forth. Were those folk at the Bank of England as how to put it politely, as confused by the strategy as everybody else seems to have been? I mean, was it as black and white that what they did was actually appeared to people like me to be rather reckless?
Yeah, well, I can't really speak for the people of the bank, but for anyone who's trained in economics at all was just bizarre. Anyone who'd been working in the bond markets for more than a year or two also realised what they were trying to do was quite, let's call it radical and not stupid. And really, they just shot themselves in the foot, both feet, I think. And yeah, I mean, it's still amazing to me that they did what they did, because anyone could have told. In fact, Rishi Sunak in the debate for who was going to take over from Boris with Liz told everyone exactly what would happen. So it wasn't news to anyone that the financial markets would look upon this very unfavorably. I mean, I think the problem was there was a huge amount of arrogance on the part of Truss and Kwarteng and those people around them that they thought they knew better. Once you start saying the Bank of England doesn't know anything, the Office for Budget Responsibility doesn't know anything, the Civil Service doesn't know anything, you've got to wonder what it is that these people think themselves. So it was a reckless thing to do, and it got the punishment it deserved, really. But unfortunately, we all paid quite a high price for that.
For sure. And my understanding is that there are those with a completely opposing view. I remember seeing Liz Truss being interviewed about the book that she wrote and was published a few months ago, I think it was. As I understand it, she would argue that the Bank of England, she's been quite specific about this, the Bank of England deliberately went out of its way to undermine the consequences of the strategy that she put forward. I heard her say that on a Radio 4 podcast thing with Chris Mason, the BBC Chris Mason guy. It was a fascinating thing to watch or listen to. I'm not sure if you watch or listen to the podcast. But anyway, and she really did try to make that point as convincingly as possible.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, most of her statements she might be a nice lady, but most of her statements don't stack up. Apparently, there was a deep state.
That's it, deep state, yeah.
Conspiracy to undermine her. There wasn't. The civil service were not trying to undermine it. They had nothing to do with it. The Bank of England had nothing to do with it. The financial markets looked at those plans and said, no, thank you. It was the Bank of England that essentially bailed the UK economy out by stepping in when things were getting really bad. So, you know, when she says The Economist was part of some leftist magazine, leftist conspiracy, you know, that's just nonsense. It's the most right of centre economics publications that you know, it's for free trade and all the things she says she stands for. And she's blaming them. So she blames everyone. It's like a child. You know, she got it badly wrong and she blames everyone apart from herself. And I honestly think she's delusional at this stage. And she also seems to have doubled down on the story. You know, she seems to have got even more extreme instead of learning some kind of lesson. So, yeah, it was a very childish period for UK politics. And as I said, we all paid a premium for that. And the FT was accused of being a leftist part of this conspiracy, which is also absolute nonsense. If anyone's read the FT knows that's not true.
It must be quite strange because I know diddly squat about economics and not pretending to know a thing about it, Andrew, but there are those that seem to say that it's not really a science. It's a more subjective thing than that. You can't be that scientific about it. And that's why it seems to be that you've got so many economists with such competing views about what the truth really is and how things really work. Martin mentioned Professor Steve Keen. He's spoken at a couple of our events in the past. When I come off an event with Professor Steve Keen, my thoughts about how the system works is kind of radically different to how I thought it worked before the session started, you know? So you seem to have these economists with such competing ideas, whereas I presume in other sciences, there is an accepted orthodoxy, if that's the right way of putting it. What would you say to that?
Economics isn't a science, it's a social science. So no, most economists wouldn't claim that it is a science, and therefore there's because it's a study of human behaviour in a particular realm in the competition for scarce goods and resources. And so it can never be a science. However, I will say there was very, very little debate amongst the economic community about what Liz Truss did, whether it was the right thing to do. Only anyone agreed what she did was right. It seems to be only her and Kwasi that thought it was the right thing to do and still think it was the right thing to do. And then they made so many ridiculous statements to begin with. They came in and they said, what this country needs is growth, and you know we need growth. Why isn't the Treasury giving us growth? Why isn't the OBR and the Bank of England giving us growth? As if the civil servants were sat there thinking, oh, do you know what? Yeah, growth. That is the answer to our problem. Thank you for telling us that, Liz. You know, it's just nonsense. You know, she was talking nonsense at the beginning. She's speaking nonsense now.
This is fascinating because obviously when we organised the date of this event, we didn't know that it would be a few weeks before the general election. So everybody now is thinking about what each of the parties are saying. As you know, Andrew, TTF isn't in any way party political aligned. So our views are generic, and everyone will have their own view on all of these things. But I know that Sir Keir Starmer was pressed recently in the debates. As we all understand, his strategy seems to be, we don't have to raise taxes, we don't have to reduce what people get through the welfare state because we're going to achieve growth. And on a couple of occasions, various presenters and program hosts have said to him, well, what's the plan B? What happens if you don't get growth? And both he and Rachel Reeves have basically responded by saying, we're not going to entertain that possibility. It's a defeatist attitude to assume we don't get growth. So talking to you as a very experienced academic and economist, how likely is it that we're going to get the growth that parties like the Labour Party seem to be building their plans on?
Well, actually, I have a couple of slides that
please
show
do.
some of the
Please
problems
do. Thank you.
that we're facing. I'll just get through them very quickly. So one of the main challenges for the old lady has been this shocking inflation performance, as I've put here, and you can see, you know, how poor the UK's performance
Andrew,
has been.
you're not sharing your slides right now.
Oh, right, okay.
Sorry, while we're having the chat, I close those down. So if you don't mind, open them up again, and we can take a look at the slides that you're referring to.
Do that again. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Is that sharing?
It is. Yeah, lovely.
Yeah. Okay. So I just put a couple of slides together. I thought we might get on to the challenges for the old lady at the moment. And the first one you can see, I mean, it's coming to terms with this, you know, this inflation shock, which is the first burst of inflation of this kind that we've really seen since the early 90s, late 80s, and so on. What you can also see is just how poor the UK's performance was relative to others, with the exception of Italy here, which made a last gasp dash to be the worst inflation performer. But, you know, you could argue that even there, you know, the UK's inflation was peaking for much longer and has taken much further to decline. And one of the problems, I think, one of the mistakes the bank made was to underestimate what was going on in the UK's labour market and its impact on inflation. So this chart shows you, you know, just to pick the blue line here, which is scale on the left here, is just total UK vacancies. And you can see how these rose dramatically and how they're still high at an historic level. So if you have lots of vacancies together, a shortage of labour, then you have the situation where the labour market is extremely tight. So anything that happens there can feed through directly into inflation very quickly. And I also put together, this is on the right-hand side, this is essentially the vacancies in the hospitality sector, which has come down, which is still relatively high. So there's been a shock to the UK labour market. Labour has been withdrawn from availability. That's either because people have left the country or left the labour market completely. So it's not always easy to tell, but we're facing now a very different labour market than we were 10 years or so ago, which was much more vibrant. And that turns into wage inflation. So here you see a tight labour market. This is an index of nominal wage growth. And as you can see, from 2014 to 2021, that rose by about 10 percentage points. But from 2021 to today, that's gone up, another 20–25% almost over a 2-year period. So, and I think the Bank of England underestimated the pass-through from the tight labour market into wage inflation, and then therefore into higher consumer price inflation too. So certainly the central bank is now having to reconsider its views of the labour market, because if the labour market is tighter, then it means that potentially any shock to demand, any sort of increase in activity will translate much more rapidly into higher inflation. And this is, someone mentioned this earlier, this is a problem not just for the bank, but also for any government that's about to take over this, whoever wins after the 4th of July. This is a picture of productivity. It's an index of productivity. If it goes up, it means people, each person is making more stuff than they were before. That's basically the way you read it. So again, from 2014 to around about just before the COVID crisis, it's risen by about 5 percentage points there. So in other words, we're producing a bit more than we were each year over that period. Then along comes COVID, and of course we're all sat at home watching telly. Well, what you can see afterwards has been just a small recovery, and then it's flatlined. And if you look closely between 2017 and 2019, it's flatlined as well. And actually, the growth rate between 2014 and 2017 is not that sharp, it's quite shallow. So what we've got is stagnating productivity. Now, you may ask the question about growth and will the UK economy generate growth after the election? It's key to the plans of the Labour Party and key to the plans of the Tory Party too. The answer is that it's going to be very hard to generate that growth with productivity behaving like this. There's two ways to increase productivity. Either you make us more productive by training us better, educating us better. So I go to work and each day I produce more than I did the day before. Or you increase the number of people making things and doing things. And that's integration. There's only two ways to increase output, and those more or less are it. And what you can see is the combined effect here is that nothing's really happened, arguably, for 7 or 8 years in terms of productivity, if you can X out the COVID story. So this is a challenge not just for the old lady to understand what's going on, but it's also going to be a challenge for the next government. And all this adds up, back to the old lady, all this adds up to a tight labour market with low productivity means we're going to be more prone to inflation shocks in the future. Inflation will probably remain higher than it otherwise would have been. And you can see in this chart, this is UK interest rates responding to those shocks. And you can also see probably that the UK is responding in terms of raising interest rates a little bit later than the US. And so one of the criticisms of the bank is that they underestimated what was going on in the labour market and the implications for inflation, and they didn't put rates up soon enough. And you can see them basically playing catch up with the US interest rate curve there. So rates are higher now than they probably would have needed to be if we got behind that phenomenon quicker. And they're also going to remain high for a relatively long period of time. So this chart shows in this gold box, this is actual Bank of England interest rate. This bit here is the projection which the market is saying, this basically guessing where the interest rates are going to go in future. And you can see there's no cut factored in to UK interest rates until probably August or September this year. And I suspect that might even get pushed out further. But we're not going back to a world where 2 or 3% interest rates. And I suspect that interest rates on the whole will be higher than they otherwise would have been, because we have this tight labour market and we have low productivity growth. So we have higher interest rates and higher inflation as a result of that. And that's a challenge for a central bank, because a central bank is there to control inflation. If it's constantly putting up rates to, or at least leaving rates higher to get rid of any inflationary shock that we have, then that makes them quite unpopular. Luckily, Rachel Reeves, if Labour do win, is ex-Bank of England. She'll have sympathy for the bank. A more populist politician might not. So I'm not sure who that populist politician might be. Who knows? But this is the consequence. This is kind of this 2014 to 2024. This is the performance of the FTSE 100 over the MSCI World performance. So if it flatlines, it means the FTSE 100 has basically kept up with the MSCI World equity market. If it goes up, it means the FTSE has outperformed. But what you can see is quite a shocking indictment of the way the world thinks about the UK economy, because let's say 60%. So the UK equity market is 40 percentage points smaller than the global equity market over this period. Yeah. So that's a quite damning indictment of UK PLC from the global equity markets. And that's, this is our pension. Now, clearly equity markets have gone up in the UK, but nowhere near as much as elsewhere. So if I just finish on this final one, whoever wins the elections is going to need some luck, So here's a picture of Rishi. I found this one, I think. This is when Rishi was asked, what are you going to do for people under the age of 30? And he said, national service, which sounded like a bit of a vote winner to me. Mm. And this is a picture of Starmer when someone said to him, what do you stand for? Because quite clearly, as Andy has kind of intimated, the Labour Party are not going to give away all their goodies. They're going to try and say as little as possible to make sure they get into power, which is pretty much what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did back in '97. So it could be one of those two, or if we're really, really, really unlucky, it might get him. Who knows? I really hope not. But yeah, so I think there's some real challenges for the bank ahead. Some of those challenges will be economic, but some of them will also be political, because I don't think whoever gets in, they're going to have to raise rates. They're going to have to raise taxes. There's no two ways about that, I'm afraid.
This is really fascinating, Andrew, really fascinating. And there's a particular set of thoughts that you've articulated that genuinely give me concern. So if I may, allow me to set out what those concerns are. We're in the early stages of writing a paper, which is a response to a prevailing narrative coming out from the City of London that there is too much regulation, too much red tape, too much bureaucracy. The country needs growth. The country desperately needs growth. We're not going to let red tape, bureaucracy, friction through regulation get in the way. There was even something in the City AM a couple of weeks ago, Andrew, you may have seen it, where I think it was UK Finance are promoting the idea that there should be, for want of a better phrase, this is my phrase, not theirs, an ambassador for deregulation. Now, to my mind, this is potentially very, very problematic, because whilst there is no doubt loads of needless, clunky, high friction, red tape, bureaucratic stuff in our regulatory environment, within it, there's also stuff that's been very intelligently constructed to try to prevent things like a global financial crisis happening all over again, to prevent things like consumers being ripped off, that they're specifically to protect the consumer. So I kind of see things a little bit like this at the moment. It's like somebody's trying to lose weight. All well and good to lose fat, or could I do with some of that? But there might come a point where you're not just losing fat, you're losing muscle tissue. I'm genuinely worried that there's a chance we may find ourselves in this post-election frenzy to stimulate growth. The lobbyists may frankly do such a good job to encourage a deregulatory agenda that we end up with whichever party's in power, not just finding ways to get rid of friction, bureaucracy, red tape, but they also end up carving out chunks of consumer protection and economy protection and global financial crisis avoiding stuff that's been really hard fought over many, many years. And without getting too dramatic about it, there's a lot of people who talk about things like the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act as being a major contributor to the global financial crisis. And I've got this worry, a lot of people in TTF have got this worry. The reason we're writing this paper is because we want to articulate a particular message to, well, most likely Rachel Reeves. Yes, we agree we need growth. Yes, we agree that there's a lack of productivity. Yes, we agree that if we should try to use growth to stimulate what we need rather than cutting benefits, reducing the welfare state budget or reducing the amount of coppers or teachers or nurses or whatever. But for goodness sake, we pray, please, 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 in your feeding frenzy of deregulation, please don't go cutting out the stuff that's actually the stabilizers on the system, be that at a consumer, at an individual consumer level or at an economy-wide level, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Are we worrying needlessly? Is there anything we could do to help prevent this potential disaster?
I think if the Tory party was hijacked by, let's call it Liz Trussites, for want of a better phrase, then I really would be worried.
Okay.
Absolutely, because those people are lunatics, frankly. and they just want to throw it use another phrase, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm less concerned about that with regard to a Labour administration, but however, that doesn't mean that we should not lobby hard for things which we think are bit, regulations that are actually protecting consumers, individuals, retailers, and so on. There's no harm in reminding a government, which is, let's face it, a left-leaning government is more likely to be paternalistic than the right-leaning one. There's no harm in writing that paper and continuing to argue that case, because who knows? Babies may be thrown out with a bit of bathwater, and we don't want that at all. But I would be less worried about that if it were a Labour victory. I'd be very, very worried if it was a Tory victory, because I think that's exactly what we get.
Your candor is really, really valued. In a moment, we'll go to Martin, then to anybody else who has any comments or questions. Allow me, if I may, just to take you a little bit of a thought experiment, Andrew. So imagine that Sebastian Oates is having a cup of coffee with Rachel Reeves, just imagining this, on July the 5th. And your character, Sebastian Oates, is talking to Rachel about this growth agenda and any potential unintended consequences of an overzealous deregulatory agenda. What would your character, not you, what would your character, Sebastian Oates, be saying to Rachel Reeves?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that by that stage you would have been governor, so maybe you will be having that conversation with her. Yeah, I think you'd be questioning what a growth agenda really means in an environment where the government is very fiscally constrained. I can see more deregulation in the form of construction and property and so on, and maybe getting rid of a little bit of greenbelt. Who cares? We need those 10,000 houses. I could see that happening more to be more likely. That will have an effect on growth. That is chucking away some regulations that protect our greenbelt and so on, and that could happen certainly. But I think he would be actually questioning, what do you mean by a growth agenda? Growth agenda is fine when you're wealthy and you've got choices and options, but when you don't, there's very few levers you can really pull. So I think he'd be skeptical about what they can actually achieve beyond the rhetoric.
Which makes me wonder, just before we go to Martin White, I can imagine therefore a scenario 2-3 years from now, 4 years from now, the growth hasn't quite been what everybody hoped and wished for, including genuinely the people in the Labour Party. And as a consequence, there's real strain in the system and people are being forced to either think about raising taxes or reducing benefits or whatever it might be. So potentially a stressy time ahead. Very, very interesting, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Definitely.
Martin, you've been very patient. I know you've had your hands been up for a while, but it's a digital one, so I hope it hasn't been sore having it up there. Martin, please do take yourself off mute and share your thought. Thank you. Then we'll go to anybody else that would like to. Thanks, Martin.
Very good. Well, it was brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Andrew. It was a great tour through things. I'd like to raise a few issues which I think matter, but which don't get talked about very much. Just to let you know, some of the influences on my thought, the most significant is Mr. Buffett. I'm fairly influenced by Andrew Smith, Fundsmith. And I think that Andrew Smithers has some really quite special insights based on some rather powerful data. I think his insights are perhaps limited, but they're powerful nonetheless and worth thinking about. And I've also discovered a lot of very good stuff coming out of the Productivity Institute, including a paper that I've put a link to by a chap called Paul Fisher. Now, in terms of the things that I think really... Is
that Paul Fisher, ex-Bank of England?
Yes, it is.
Yes, I used to work with Paul.
Yeah, no, I've been very impressed with him. I went to a meeting, I spoke to him a bit, and he was asked to do a paper, but then what he did in response was something which is much more surveying the world and thinking around the subject in a very, 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 very good way. And if you haven't read it, I really, really recommend that. Now, the aspects which I think don't get much discussion. Number one, balance of payments. We're not paying our way. The fact that we're in a bad balance of payment situation is really, I think, the reason Rachel Reeves hit the deck bloody quick. And the next point, productivity. You get better productivity if you're
Martin, forgive me interrupting you. I didn't quite understand what you meant. Rachel Reeves hitting the deck because, help me understand that a bit better.
I didn't say Rachel Reeves hitting the deck. What did I say? I can't remember what I said. Sorry. Oh no. Sorry, not Rachel Reeves. Rubbish. Liz Truss.
Liz Truss. Oh, okay, sorry. I now understand.
No, you're quite right. How to confuse an audience and leave them in a complete pickle. Basically, the international market said, no way. We're going to write down the UK bonds. End of bloody story. Now, next thing is interest rates. It seems to have been accepted economic theory that to increase activity, you reduce interest rates. Well, I think what you do if you reduce interest rates is increase asset prices and speculation. I believe, and I get this from not just Andrew Smithers, but also a really amazing impressive Marxist Pakistani stroke American thinker, Anwar Sheikh. And basically what he says is it's profits what drives growth. Now, it seems that if you look over what stock markets have achieved, especially in the US over the long time, they've achieved a certain rate of return on capital, real rate of return on capital of something like between 6 and 7% real post-tax over 150 plus years. Now, that's not inconsistent with companies when they're running themselves, stewarded shareholder equity and saying, we want at least a certain real return on shareholder equity. If we don't get that return, we won't deploy the money. If we can borrow a bit, but not over borrow, we will borrow a bit, especially if it aids things. So I think if you're going to want growth in investment, you're going to get growth in productivity. And I think what the country needs is to be in businesses where it exports at a decent level of productivity. And over the last couple of decades, of course, we've lost a lot of that. You can't put the clock back, and it's beautifully put in Paul Fisher's paper. You can't put the clock back and wish us all into manufacturing again. But if you're in the more high-tech things and you've got a strong position, you're better off as a country. And other countries have been saving and investing more than the UK. The UK is, I went to an event that Kay and King organized, and King's summing up of all this was that we're the lowest savers in the G20. And what he meant was he was including government spending, government saving. So basically, we've not been investing enough, but just saying invest more without having something that's profitable to do it with ain't so good. The paper by Paul Fisher about the project of renewal and investment and all that doesn't quite cover this point. But what it is bloody clear is as a nation, we need to invest like stink, not just because of climate change, for other things as well. And you can't just magically have growth. You've got to make investment profitable. And of course, if your people are more effective, they're better trained, they're not sick, they're not poisoned by ultra processed food and all that. All sorts of things you can do on the supply side to make things better. And the Productivity Institute, I think, is doing phenomenally good work on that. But no one's really biting the bullet and admitting the deep shit we're in terms of balance of payments, because we're getting poorer every year as we own less and less of our land. There you go. That's me.
Martin, thank you. Andrew, any reflections on what Martin has said?
Yeah, I mean, the growth in productivity in the UK has been referred to as a productivity puzzle because it has been very weak. And ultimately, that's not good. Doesn't matter if you're a country or a business or productivity has to grow. And it hasn't, it's been very weak. But to be honest, most governments since the end of the Second World War have been trying to boost productivity because they know that's the answer to many of their problems. You know, even though Liz Truss thought she was the first person to discover it, they've all tried. The problem that any government is going to have after July 4th is that they have very few levers to pull to actually make that happen. Labour will try to improve the supply side of the economy. They may succeed, but yeah, we've yet to see whether that's going to happen or not. But yeah, it's a conundrum, and if we don't solve it, you know, the UK's economy will continue to falter.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you,
I
Andrew.
think the other thing that really comes through, and this isn't lengthy for me now, is the need for a cross-party consensus about a lot of things so that we have a policy that's well thought out, properly faced up to, and the parties agree that these principles are going to be adopted across parliaments. Otherwise,
now that is definitely fiction, because that's never going to happen, is it? That would make a good book. It's nice in theory, but it will unlikely to happen. Particularly if Labour do win and Conservatives loses in the way that it's being forecast at the moment. You know, there's a good chance that the Conservative Party, as we knew it 10 years ago, will never reappear and will just move away to the extremes and therefore never be part of any consensus, which will be a shame. It's going to take a strong leader to pull that party back together towards the centre, and it's going to take more than 5 years.
But a consensus amongst the academic community about the policies to be adopted would be rather good, especially ones that weren't fussing all the time about asset prices.
Yeah. Okay.
A very enlightened and very optimistic view, getting that degree of collaboration. But that's ultimately actually what we the people want. You know, everyone talks about would it be better if the politicians spent more time agonising over the solutions and how to defeat each other. I get your point entirely, Martin. And Andrew, before we go to anybody else that wants to chip into the conversation, Nigel, I'll be very keen to get your thoughts in a moment about what we've been talking about, then Duncan, then others. Something I definitely don't understand, I've heard it a few times, is the Reform Party's idea of stopping the payments from the Bank of England to the commercial banks on interest. I've heard those lines mentioned a couple of times. I don't really understand what it means, but I think the claim is it will save about £35 billion.
Yeah.
Is that something you can tell us about, please?
Well, first of all, it's much more complicated than Nigel would have everyone believe. At the moment, it's payment on those reserves at the policy rate is part of the way in which the Bank of England transmits its policy rate through the rest of the economy. So if banks are receiving, let's say, 5.25% from the Bank of England, which they are at the moment, it kind of sets a floor to what those banks are going to charge anyone else. So if the bank sets that rate at 5.25 for the commercial banks for their reserves, that gets transmitted to the rest of the economy. So if they change it to 4%, that 4% will be transmitted to the rest of us because the banks will charge us 4 and a bit after that point. So it's certainly not as simple as Nigel suggests. You have to have a wholesale reform of monetary policy and the operation of it, and that would not be simple at all. Second thing to say is if you had money in a bank and the bank was paying you 5.25, and then the bank turns around and says, actually, we're going to give you 0, what would you do? You remove your money. And then two things happen there. I mean, firstly, monetary policy is far less effective. And secondly, you're saving no money at all now.
Depending on asset prices, it might be at that point, depending on asset prices, it might be good to go into the stock market. Depends whether it's crashed nicely or not.
Yeah, I mean, banks, well, I'm hoping banks wouldn't just pile into a stock market. But the point is that is part of the monetary policy process and the way in which interest rates get transmitted through the economy. So we would need to do much more than just stop paying money on those reserves. Yeah.
Fascinating. So it may not be that sound a strategy after all. How
What a
intriguing.
surprise from Nigel.
What a surprise there. Thanks, Andrew. Mr. Nigel Cairns, let's go to you. Any comments, questions that's come off the back of this conversation? Anything front of mind for you, Nigel?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
I've got 3 things written down, but I'll start with the last one I wrote down first.
Okay.
Andy made reference earlier on to the growing city campaign for regulatory bonfire. And there are various facets to that. But of course, at the moment, that could be seen as an opportunist movement, particularly by UK finance, because we've got this competition between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party at the moment to appear to be the city's best friend and pro-growth agenda and all that sort of thing. So they're all disporting themselves at the moment, making all sorts of ridiculous promises. But going forwards, things aren't going to be, and everybody knows it, quite so simple as getting rid of having this big bonfire of regulation, and then we all take off, and we've got a marvelous economy again. One of the difficulties, which hasn't been discussed widely in this electoral debate so far, is the issue of equivalence with the European community, and their view on how much interplay there should be in the marketplace for financial services in Europe, in particular, and the UK. And they've got a very strong negotiating position, I think, to put the kibosh or the stranglehold on UK financial firms if they want to. If there's a greater yawning of difference in the regulatory structure for the two for Europe versus the UK. I think that the Europeans are going to see this very much as an opportunity for allowing Paris and Frankfurt and other European financial centres to perhaps shine and take competitive advantage away from London. How do you see that scenario playing out?
Well, I think first of all, I don't see any obvious link between getting rid of regulations and growth. There a lot of what is spoken about is just complete nonsense. Take out regulations,
absolutely agree with that.
grow faster. At best, I think it's a reduction in costs of business. It doesn't make the business grow faster at all. However, there are some, like I said, with planning restrictions on actual buildings, you can see a direct connection between the reduction in the regulatory reduction in regulations and the positive activity. You can see it's positive in terms of growth. Most of the rest is just cost. They're not complaining. They're not saying that they're going to grow faster. They're just saying we'd like lower costs, please. It's not going to. I don't think that will wash with a Labour government.
I think they're also saying they want light touch regulation, but not calling it.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what
they're disguising what they're saying.
Yeah, which is what they had before, and that's how we got the global financial crisis. So I think they'll get short shrift once this election is over. But in terms of the EU, so UK companies, if they want to sell their products into Germany and France, they're going to have to maintain certain standards. They can't get away from that again. So I don't think they're going to be lobbying for changes in regulations, which mean they can't sell their products into the EU. So that would be rather silly. Again, I see that sort of lobbying for just burning up regulation for the sake of it. I see that very much as a far-right agenda, and I see that being very unlikely to be the outcome of this next election. So I'd be more optimistic that it won't happen than pessimistic than it would. So, but I'm not a politician, so who knows?
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Thank you, Nigel. Would anybody else like to chip in with any comments and questions? We'll be wrapping up in due course in a few minutes' time, probably. Before we do, would anybody else like to chip in with any further comments? Please just raise your hand if you do.
Steve just raised his hand.
Thank you. Steve, please do. Cheers, Andrew. Steve.
Yes, please. Very short, sharp question. Right. Apologies to everybody, first of all, for being very, very late, and to our speaker, I apologise for that, Professor Clare. My one and only question, which really requires only a yes or answer thing, is: do you have to believe me? I fear it didn't get through, but do you have to believe in the neoliberal economy in order to join the Bank of England?
Do you have to believe in a neoliberal economy to what? I didn't pick up that.
I think it was to work at the Bank of England.
No, not at all. I would say.
I beg your pardon. No, I'm sorry about that. Exactly that.
I would say most of the people in the Bank of England have an outlook which, where they want to do good for society, and they see that as their role there. They're often foregoing much larger salaries that they could get elsewhere. So I'm not saying they're all Labour voters, but I think they're sort of left-leaning in their thinking, at least. They're certainly not neoliberal. But they are paternalistic in a good sense of the word. They have the ability to make our lives better with monetary policy decisions. They can't do everything. There's fiscal policy as well, so they can't do everything. But they can do what they can do to serve out.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Steve. Would anybody else like to chip in with a comment or a question here? There's a bit of a delay with Steve. Back to Nigel.
Nigel.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Right. Andrew, back to the book.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Because I'm intrigued. You make reference. I haven't read the book, but you made various references to dark forces being a major theme in the book, and I was wondering to what extent, consciously or subconsciously, is the book an attempt to educate everybody for the existence of these dark forces, and what's your sort of personal concerns about these dark forces?
Yeah, I guess so. I started writing that book with this idea of the dark forces a very long time ago, well before I understood anything about the internet and the way that the internet could be manipulated by, who knows, foreign bodies and so on to influence us. It was much more in a kind of espionage sense that, there's, a bit like James Bond, there's these evil spectre out there. Nobody really knows what it is or where it is, but it's doing bad things. The implication in the book, but I won't give that away. There is an implication of where this dark force is coming from. But the main reason I refer to it as dark force is because it's anti-democratic and it's trying to push people. And one of the key characters sort of scoffs at the British public and the fact that they want to make their own choice about things. And he's I think he's quite a colourful character, but he's deliberately odious because he's really anti-democratic. So by dark forces, I mean anti-democratic forces. And I think there are anti-democratic forces, surging through lots of economies and lots of countries at the moment. And that's,
so the book's not dated in any way then?
Well, I hope not. Yeah,
in that respect.
I mean, the book is about life at the Bank of England to some extent, but with war, murder, blackmail and kidnap. When I was at the Bank of England, as far as I was aware, there was none of that, but who knows? It may have been going on behind the scenes. But yeah, so I think we do need to be aware that there are these forces which kind of defeat the will of good people. And the post office example is a perfect example of that.
Well said.
Anyone who's watched that saga unfold, just those poor people. And, behind the scenes, there were dark forces thwarting them every single turn. So luckily, the dark horses in my book get thwarted themselves. So that's good. So yeah, so to some extent, yes, it is a sort of reflection at least about that as a possibility.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Nigel, Andrew. Folks,
Richard's going to stand up.
we'll go to Richard, then we'll look to bring the conversation to a close. Richard Emery, your thought, please. Thank you.
Okay, let's be honest. There's a whole lot of what has been talked about today that has just gone whoosh. Because I'm not an economist, and there's a whole lot. So I'm going to make 3 comments, right? And I'll just chuck these into the melting pot. I completely failed to understand the increase in interest rates sort of 18 months ago, because the way that I saw this was the increase in interest rates was designed to mean that people who had mortgages ended up with less income, and therefore they could spend less, and therefore that would reduce the pressures on inflation. But actually, people who had mortgages were typically locked into deals for 2 or 3 years. So the increase in interest rates actually made diddly squat difference to them. Actually, what it did do was it meant that people who had savings and pensions actually got more money and therefore could put more money into the economy. So I just completely failed to understand how the interest rate levers work. But don't come back on that. I'm just expressing that view. That's my level of sort of naivety, misunderstanding about the way. So I just saw this and I thought, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't seem to work. I'll make another comment from the stuff I've been doing in terms of authorised push payment fraud. I was astounded to discover a little while ago that nobody regulated the CHAPS system. So we were in a major dispute on the issue of CHAPS, and the Bank of England said it was regulated by the FCA. The FCA said it was regulated by the PSR, and the PSR said it was regulated by the Bank of England. And we went round and round and round trying to work out why this fundamental fake payment system within the UK was actually not being properly regulated by the Bank of England, who actually own the system. So for me, what we saw there were the banks being allowed by the regulators to behave badly. And I have a particular beef on this issue because I have a case of a bank who allowed somebody to submit a CHAPS payment request in the branch. And when it got to head office, they processed it as an international payment because the money was going to Southern Ireland, but they didn't actually ask the customer's permission to do so. So there have been lots of breaches, and I haven't seen the Bank of England stepping in and properly managing one of our highest value payment systems. So that's pretty, which I'm really struggling with. But my other comment just looks to the future, is we are due in October to get mandatory reimbursement of authorised push payment fraud. There are 2 comments on this. We're already seeing that the banks are pushing back against that, and they're saying they want it pushed back by a year. But the other thing is, we are all used to the idea at the moment that when we make a faster payment, the money will be in the bank by the following day. Normally it goes instantly, but at the very latest, it will be in the bank by the following business day. The banks appear to have persuaded the Treasury, in light of the mandatory reimbursement, to allow them to hold payments for up to 4 business days if they suspect that that's the result of fraud or deception. But I can tell you now that any customer who has their money held and they go to the bank and say, why are you concerned? The bank is going to respond by saying, we can't tell you, because if we tell you, we will actually be breaching the law because we will risk tipping you off to suspected fraudulent activity. So overall, I'm pretty cheesed off with the whole of the banking system. And I mean, Andy would know.
Sort it out, Andrew. You got 3 minutes.
Okay. So first of all, with regard to interest rates, I mean, interest rates affect many other things other than mortgage rates. And in fact, some mortgage rates would be variable. And the Bank of England understand that when they make an interest rate change, it takes a time to come through. And the more fixed rates there are, the longer it will take. So, which is possibly an argument for them acting sooner than they did, which I made a point about earlier. In terms of the rest, I'm really not an expert, but I would say it's down to the government to tell which organisation it is that's actually the official regulator. If nobody's officially regulating chaps, the government should say, Bank of England, PRA, whatever, you are now the official regulator. You know, unless they have that guidance from government, you know, they're not the regulator. So I would blame the government.
Thank you very much indeed. Folks, we're going to bring the conversation to a close. Before we do, I'm going to ask Professor Andrew Clare if he has any final comments. And then, of course, I'll be inviting everybody to show our appreciation for the session tonight and encourage everybody to buy the book. I put a link to it in the chat a few minutes ago. Andrew, any final comments from you, sir? Thank you.
No, not really. I was also going to try and encourage you to read the book. I think it'll be a good thing to take on holiday. It's an easy read, and it talks about a lot of the things you do know about. But I would say, other than that, I think this is going to be quite a testing time for any new government coming in, and it's going to be therefore a testing time for the old lady once again, because she will come under pressure from people like Richard if they put up rates again and so on. So, you know, it's going to be a difficult time for all concerned.
Fantastic. Professor Andrew Clare, we really appreciate you having written the book. We've all got the choice to go and get it now. Thank you very much indeed. That couldn't be happening if you hadn't written it. Yeah. Let's all find out a bit more about Sebastian, and let's see how he handles the global financial crisis in the next one. Good luck in finishing that. Can we please show appreciation to Professor Andrew Clare?
Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. We're very, very grateful. Lovely to talk to you as always, Andrew, and thank you so much for your general supportiveness to what we're trying to do at TTF.
Thank you for all your time this evening. Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye all. Bye all.